The Ukrainian military is breaking as we speak. The front lines in the eastern province of Donetsk are collapsing at an alarming rate. I think there's no other way to describe it. Every report from the front line says the situation is just getting worse and worse on the eastern front for the Ukrainian army. Now, I went out on a limb and put myself out there with a very controversial opinion on the recent US aid package. I had said that the announcement of that aid package was really just a propaganda ploy, because not only is most of the aid not going to the front line in Ukraine, but the $14 billion that is supposed to go to help the Ukrainian army is really just going to create jobs in the US defense industry, and probably, in my estimation, never will and never was intended to be sent to Ukraine.
If you look at the investments that we made in Ukraine's defense to deal with this aggression, 90% of the security assistance we provided has actually been spent here in the United States with our manufacturers, with our production, and that's produced more American jobs, more growth in our own economy. So this has also been a win-win that we need to continue.
So my opinion was that the whole purpose of the announcement of the US aid was simply to try to boost Ukrainian morale to stave off collapse before or during the US elections. No one else I've heard on any of the stations I listen to is making this theory. But all the reports I hear since that video I made almost 2 weeks ago support this very bold claim. And today I'm going to go through some of those reports briefly. And with that, let's get into it. So the first report we will look at today is from Japan News on the 29th of April, entitled "Ukraine Warns of Worsened Front as Russia Claims Fresh Gains." And here we have a report from the very top of Ukraine's military chain, the Commander-in-Chief himself, General Suki, who said in a Facebook post that the situation at the front has worsened and that Ukrainian troops had retreated to a new defense line in a section of the front that runs past the city of Donetsk, controlled by pro-Russian forces since 2014. Russia, the general said, and I quote, had a significant advantage in forces and means, and in some sectors, the enemy had some tactical success, as the general described it. Around this time of just before May, Russia's defense ministry claimed its troops had captured the village of Novobakhmutivka, which is about 10 kilometers north of Avdiivka. So what we see is exactly what I predicted in my video called The Ides of March, where I compared the fall of Avdiivka to the Ides of March, which signaled the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. The Russian seizing of Avdiivka, which was Ukraine's principal fortress in the defense of Donetsk, also signaled the end of Ukraine's resistance in my estimation. I even said this months before anyone was talking about it in this video here entitled Final Fight, that Avdiivka would be the last major battle of the Ukraine war. So let's begin with Newsweek, and I'm going to take you through the reports in chronological order as best as I can, to bring us up to speed on the frontline situation. So the 30th of April, Newsweek published an article entitled "Ukraine War Maps Show Russia's Two Options for Advancing." Now take a look at the map around the breakthrough at Ocheretyne as reported by the ISW, which I reported on this video a week ago, and compare it to the map that looks like from today from Live UA Map, which is a Ukrainian war mapper. We can see the extent of the Russian progress here. So Newsweek says that Russian forces have the opportunity to choose among multiple tactical directions for further offensive drives near Avdiivka, but that it remains unclear where they will focus their efforts in the near future. So this goes to the point I made in the video on Russia's attrition strategy. We are now in the second and final phase of attrition, which involves a major Russian offensive. That offensive, however, will not be focused at one point, but will be spread across the entire front, so that Ukraine won't know where to defend, but instead would have to defend everywhere, thereby stretching out their depleted ammunition and reserves. So I suggest you pause this video to watch that video for context, or watch it from the end-screened options. So Newsweek reports that several prominent war bloggers claim that Russian forces are conducting offensive operations near a town called Ocheretyne, which is situated right here on the map, to advance toward, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, Arkhangelsk, while also trying to advance west from Ocheretyne area to Suki and southwest to the Novobakhmutivka Selivka Persia line. We will see later in this report that Russia made good on that advance toward Arkhangelsk. So the ISW assessed that the continued Russian stabilization of the salient northwest of Avdiivka, presumably they're talking about the Ocheretyne salient, presents the Russian command with a choice of either continuing to push west towards its reported operational objective in Pokrovsk, or trying to drive northward to conduct possible complementary offensive operations with the Russian effort around Chasiv War. Now remember, in my report on the Ocheretyne collapse, I discussed the witch hunt for who was responsible for the collapse of a defensive line that allowed the Russian motor rifle brigade to continue to create the salient into Ocheretyne. Well, also on the 30th of April, Al Jazeera reported that some Ukrainian servicemen, which took over Ocheretyne's defense, blame its collapse on the commander's mistakes. So here's a quote from one of the servicemen on X, formerly Twitter. "My company was literally destroyed. We carried out tasks in the worst conditions, and no one cared. We stormed without support and with stupid command. We defended with almost no support and with the same stupid command." General Sergei Provonus, a Ukrainian general who became known for his criticism of the Kiev regime's insistence on defending Bakhmut, when he opined that they should have pulled out since January to avoid further losses.
З точки зору, я на початку лютого чітко сказав, що нема сенсу тримати Бахмут. Така м'ясорубка, в якій ми втрачаємо найкращих людей, які мали досить попередні бої, особливо що стосується контрнаступальних боїв літа осені минулого року. І треба було по максимуму зберегти цих людей. Бо росіяни, які під Солідарами, під Бахмутами, знищували свої відброси, скажімо так, що стосується якраз тих, хто сиділи.
And if you want to get my coverage on Bakhmut battle, which I deem to be the most important battle of the Ukraine war, as it broke the back of the Ukrainian army, check out these two videos. The Ukrainian General Provonus said this in a televised remark. What we have is a serious systemic failure, because as I said in my last video on the Ocheretyne collapse, it was the second time in just a few weeks that the Ukrainian brigade refused to fight, as did the 67th Brigade around Chasiv War. But remember my point about the US aid package being just a ruse? Well, over a week after its announcement, here's what Al Jazeera reported a Russian expert at the Russian Academy of Military Sciences said. And he said this: "The downside is that all of Ukraine knows, all the servicemen know that there's no money, no equipment, a dire shortage of air defense systems. And when the Ukrainian General Suki commands a withdrawal, people simply run," he said. The General Suki, he said, provoked the panic himself. In fact, Kiev's own analyst Mikhail Zyrokov told Radio NV that this is not just a tactical breakthrough, but of a strategic level, and that's why Russia will only strengthen their pressure. By the 1st of May, Al Jazeera reported of more ground being seized by the Russians as Kiev's forces await supplies. Well, we shall see how that goes. And it's generally more of the same coming from the front line. The article reports of Russians taking more villages, and that the towns of Novobakhmutivka, Semenivka, and Solovoye have all fallen to the Russians. And this all occurred in just a matter of days. And perhaps precisely because there's literally no good news on the front line for Ukraine, its Western backers, perhaps as a sort of consolation, make wild statements about Russian casualties that, quite frankly, I don't think anyone following this war at this stage could take it seriously. For instance, Al Jazeera reported that the UK's Minister of State for the Armed Forces, Leo Ducherty, said that Russia had suffered an estimated, and get this, 450,000 casualties since the 2022 invasion. That would mean that Russia had lost twice the amount of the 190,000 soldiers it entered Ukraine with in February 2022. So I will let you decide how believable that is. But Al Jazeera noted that whatever Russian losses are, they consist of mostly low-quality troops. A Ukrainian platoon commander told Ukrainian media that Russian forces were unleashing Storm Z and Storm V convicts as a first wave of attack, followed by elite Russian paratrooper units.
Это слышишь, ЧВК Вагнер называется. Первый грех – это дезертирство. Никто не дает заднюю. Никто не отступает. Никто не сдается в плен. Второй грех – это алкоголь, наркотики. В зоне боевых действий. Пока полгода вы с нами, вы все время в зоне боевых действий. И третий грех – это мародерка, включая сексуальные контакты с местными женщинами, флорой, фауной, мужчинами, там, с кем угодно. Минимальный возраст, который мы берем, возраст, это 22 года. Если моложе, бумажка от ближайших родственников, то они не против. Максимальный возраст, условно, это кто нам нужен? Нам нужны только штурмовики. 60% моих...
And this is a Mongol warfare tactic of conscripting prisoners as a first wave of attack. And this is exactly what Russia did in the bloodiest battle of the war, the Bakhmut battle, while Ukraine lost their most experienced men. Again, I said this months ago when I made the case in this video here, which performed well, that Russia had already won the war by then. Down in the south of Ukraine, Al Jazeera reported that Russia had recaptured a section of Ocheretyne in the Zaporizhian region, which, as they quote, Ukrainian forces retook at great expense during their counteroffensive last year. But what has seemed to be completely overlooked by all Western media is the fact that on the 1st of May, Russian sources made good on their planned advance mentioned earlier in this video when they captured the town of Arkhangelsk by attacking it from three sides, from the south, from the east, and the west. Ukraine had little choice, as either they stayed in the town and tried to flee to the north under a hailstorm of shells and bombs, or they surrendered. And this stark choice seems to be the only options that Ukrainians on the front are being given of recent. BBC News published this article on the 2nd of May entitled "No Safety in Retreat," and Ukrainian soldiers say that their air defensive lines barely exist amid the Russian advance.
Всім привіт. Я ще живий. Вчора нас сильно потріпало. Мам, пробач мене, будь ласка. Я обіцяв, що приїду додому. Я очень тебя люблю. Мамусь. Я обіцяю, що зроблю все, щоб лишатися рядом з тобою. Мені дуже тяжко. Я устав, мама. Я так не хочу більше воювати. Ну, це того не стоїть, мама.
And this was one of the major reasons why I predicted that Avdiivka would be the last major battle of this Ukraine war. So instead of using their resources to build a proper defensive system in Donetsk, the Kiev regime decided to instruct their army to launch these suicidal offensives against prepared Russian defensive lines last year. So the ABC article details the very one-sided nature of the war on the Eastern Front, with Russian aviation devastating Ukrainian defensives with their 1.5-ton glide bombs. It repeats what we have heard ad infinitum of Ukraine's forces being outgunned and outnumbered, and that they had to pull back from 3 villages in a single day. But here are 2 points I think you should take from this article. First is that Ukraine had allocated 38 billion of their own currency, which is the equivalent of around $960 million to build an extensive fortification network supposedly to be done this year. But all of the soldiers say that this should have occurred since last year, as the current relentless Russian shelling prevents any such construction amidst a Russian advance. And this quote sums it up for you. Building a second line approximately 2 to 5 kilometers behind the front line and within range of Russian artillery is the responsibility of Ukraine's poorly resourced engineering force. That's a quote from the article. The third defensive line, at a greater distance from the battle, is supposed to be constructed by companies under military contracts. The second statement is that the much-awaited US aid package is expected to help Ukraine close the firepower gap, but that aid had not yet arrived and could take weeks, in which time Russia will only continue to advance. And advance they shall. The West has now predicted further captures for Russia for the foreseeable future. In this article from Business Insider, reported on the 3rd of May that it's only a matter of time before Russia captures the key town of Chasiv War. Chasiv War, which was described as being a little more than rubble after a year of bombardment, is a hilltop position that helped serve as a staging ground for Ukrainian skirmishes on the Russian advance and helped block the Russian advance to the last of the Ukrainian free cities in the province of Donetsk. Now listen to this part here. They compare the strategic value of Bakhmut to Chasiv War, and the article states that Bakhmut was considered of minimal strategic value, but in contrast, Chasiv War's high ground and proximity to important cities means huge potential gains for Russia. Remember how they started off saying Bakhmut had much importance and then it diminished as Russia advanced and took it? Chasiv War is described as the key that will open the gate for exhaustive and long-lasting battles. Its capture, they say, would put in reach of the Russian forces the headquarters of Ukraine's Eastern Command in the town of Kramatorsk, which is likely the final defensive line for the entire Donetsk Oblast. Here's the last bit of news I want to report, which I think could be an indicator of Russia's plans for the Kiev regime. According to several reports, including this one from Los Angeles Times, Russia has put President Zelensky, along with his predecessor, on its list of wanted people for unspecified criminal charges. Russian officials didn't yet clarify the allegations, but the list of wanted officials includes scores of officials from Ukraine and NATO countries. Now, one can only speculate the purpose of this, but could it be a way of giving President Putin a reason to take Zelensky captive when Ukraine collapses, as many Western officials suspect could happen this year after the Russian offensive this summer? What I find interesting is that Media Zona reported that Zelensky was included on this list since late February this year. Why I find this interesting is because that's also when Avdiivka fell to Russia, which, as I have stated repeatedly, was to me the beginning of the end for the Ukrainian defense of Donetsk. Could it be speculated that Putin knew from then that Ukraine would collapse, giving him a perfect opportunity and reason for Zelensky's capture? Let's watch on and see.